Hello and welcome to Business Edge magazine. I'm Ernest Granson, senior editor, and with me today we have Evan Berry, executive director at Energy Connections Canada. We've invited Evan to provide some insight into a vitally important national initiative, the Memorandum of Understanding between the Government of Canada and the Government of Alberta, signed November of 2025 by Prime Minister Mark Carney and Premier Danielle Smith. Evan, thanks so much for being with us today to talk about this.
Thanks, Ernest, for the opportunity. Nice to meet you.
You know, with a dramatically altered international relationships during this past year, Canada, like so many other nations, finds itself virtually having to create its own internal stimulus. And you can't mention the word economy in this country without also using the word energy. And that brings us to Energy Connections Canada. Can you describe the mission of ECC and its association with the memorandum?
Yes, we are the Association of Canada's pipeline companies and their supporting industries. We have some 50 plus members who are active across the country as owner operators in crude oil, refined products, and natural gas pipelines, as well as those interested in building CO2 pipelines, along with their supporting industries. So those companies that are contracted to build and construct and be vendors to pipeline owner operators. And our objective is simply to help grow the pipeline business and support Canada's largest export by value and volume, which is energy products, and to help contribute to Canada's economy from coast to coast.
Now, we're well past the original April 1st deadline to produce agreements for four of the items in the MOU. I believe two of the items have been resolved. Those would be the methane equivalency framework and the project assessment cooperation deal. So what's still under discussion is industrial carbon pricing and the MOU with the oil sands pathways companies. Now, do I have that correct?
That is correct, except there are more than just that. It was a very comprehensive MOU. It talked about interties, nuclear power, data centers, as well as the anti-greenwashing legislation. And I think when one reads through the MOU, we appreciate exactly how much both governments put on the table to discuss and to reset the Government of Canada and Government of Alberta's relationship, frankly, regarding energy policy. And so for those of us in the industry, whether it's upstream or pipelines or otherwise, the MOU represents a profound change in direction and a profoundly positive change in direction where the Government of Canada is now seeking to embrace and advance, to our mind, responsible resource development, which is refreshing and important. For many of those of us who have been in the business, we understand how large this industry is for Canada. We, frankly, in many respects, are a petro economy. It is our number one largest export. In fact, eclipsing the value of the next top four exports combined. And so it's a massive opportunity for us. And as we appreciate, we have some 171 billion barrels of oil in reserves and 1,300 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And so we are, in fact, an energy superpower, and it's incredibly refreshing to see the Government of Canada recognize that and seek to advance the industry.
Well, CCA was a major contributor to an important report developed by the Business Council of Alberta. And that report is called Restoring Confidence in Major Project Reviews, which discusses the current Canadian Energy Regulator Act and its impact on decision making for major projects in Canada. Can you describe for me the input from CCA into this report?
Yes, ECC participated in the Business Council of Alberta's report, From Barriers to Breakthroughs. And the Business Council of Alberta was asked by its members, our members overlap, to create a detailed roadmap for legislative change for principally the federal government, given what we've seen over the past decade or so, which is a pancaking increase of regulation and regulators. There are now several regulators in the pipeline space. And so seizing upon the federal government's commitment to move to one project, one review, one decision, the Business Council undertook a series, a four-part series of recommendations that really laid out the changes that industry wanted to see. And Energy Connections Canada contributed one paper of the four, which is around the Canada Energy Regulator Act and what needs to really change in legislation to make the CER the one-stop shop for pipelines in Canada, which would be a profound increase to investor confidence in the Canadian pipeline business. As you appreciate, the last number of years, we've seen projects really be burdened by the delay associated with regulatory review and construction. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is one example of a project that took some 11 years to go from application to actual operations. In the meantime, some projects were simply abandoned. Energy East and Northern Gateway projects that would have been in operation by now were simply shelved due to the preponderance of delay, uncertainty, and risk associated with regulation in Canada. So we are answering the call with those papers. How can we get to an efficient regulatory process? And those papers reflect a blueprint or roadmap for the federal government to consider.
Well, one of the recommendations, the major recommendations in that report from the CCA was that, and I quote from the report, the CER Act should be amended to remove the requirements for a governor and council decision at the end of the review process. And the CER should make the final determination on whether a project can go ahead to depoliticize the review process and to increase regulatory certainty and improve investor confidence. So would that recommendation have the highest priority for the ECC and its members?
Well, we had several of them. I think, generally speaking, the idea of empowering the Canada Energy Regulator to be that one-stop shop on behalf of the Government of Canada in its review of projects, and the idea of taking out cabinet, governor or council or cabinet review after the fact is one element of that. Changing the preamble in the legislation to create a positive obligation to advance responsible energy development is another change. But the idea of having a quasi-judicial body that's governed both in its commission and its board by experts to sit through a hearing with all of its due process protections to both interveners and applicants, and then it resolves a decision only for applicants then to wait for a cabinet review, seems to defeat the purpose of having a standalone entity, which is supposed to be depoliticized and quasi-judicial, only then to return things back to a politicized process, only layers on the risk of a project from a proponent's perspective. You want to have a clear line of sight to your approval, especially an approval that's overseen by a technically competent body like an independent regulator. What you don't want to have happen is too many touch points where politicized decision making can intervene in what could and should be a technical review of a project based on its merits.
Right, and that seems to speak also to this other statement from the report, which says any such review decision should focus on how projects can be developed, not whether they should be.
Well, that again goes back to the technical review. And so if you appreciate, the regulator asked applicants to explain the merits of the project, economically, environmentally, a public consultation. If you can demonstrate to the regulator that you have an economically viable project, you have the reserves, you have the shipper commitments, you have a place to sell the product to, that should check the box that this thing makes sense to proceed. On top of the economic drivers, of course, are, have you filed a project in accordance with the regulator's expectations of you, how you manage the engineering, the adherence to CSA standards, and of course the consultation. So the intention of these regulators is to technically review projects based on a very robust set of checklists. In fact, this is how projects used to be approved in Canada, and we pointed the example in the paper of the Alliance Pipeline project, which was a 3,800 kilometer greenfield project from Northeast BC to Chicago. It was conceived in 1996 and actually approved, reviewed, and constructed in 2001. So projects of that scale have been built in Canada in an efficient manner, and the project remains today in service, is safe, and is providing value to its customers and to landowners ever since.
What kind of impact do you think this report from the Business Council of Alberta, considering that it's from this province, what impact will that have on MOU negotiations, if any?
Well, I would applaud the Business Council for one, that this work of describing the legislative changes required to achieve one project, one review, had to be done by somebody. And we are particularly proud as a Alberta headquartered outfit that the Business Council of Alberta took on a project that frankly benefits all energy development across the country, because it is speaking to federal legislation. And so we're incredibly grateful that the Business Council of Alberta took this initiative on. And so we think that again, it is the most comprehensive set of recommendations for the federal government to simply consider, look at, and hopefully lead to omnibus legislation based on these recommendations to affect the change that the federal government itself asked for. It said and committed to one project, one review, to move from delay to delivery, to build at a speed not seen in generations. And so the Business Council and through our contribution, we brought through a roadmap for the federal government to effect a host of changes to accelerate resource development in Canada. So to answer your question, we are grateful this was done by the BCA and believe that it can be considered simply by the federal government as a blueprint to achieve the things that's promised.
I wonder if I can just ask one specific question here about some of the recommendations. Now, carbon capture is a critical role in the MOU, specifically with the pathway partner companies. What needs to be hashed out in those discussions?
Well, there's probably a lot of matters. I think the principal one that was conditional upon the advancement of the Pathways project is the resolution of the province of Alberta's effective 130 per ton carbon pricing regime, and how that is going to evolve over time. And there are clearly a host of trade-offs in the MOU. The federal government committed to helping recognize the Oil Sands Alliance project and a West Coast oil project as projects in the national interest. And those projects would benefit from the Major Project Office's assistance. Now, a quid pro quo for that was alignment and clarity of climate policy, including, as you appreciate, Canada has one carbon price, but the last federal government added on a cap and trade climate pricing regime, as well as a clean electricity pricing regime. So Canada was facing three pancaked, cross-threading climate policies that in the MOU have been resolved into one, which is the movement of the province to achieve an effective 130 per ton. And that remains, as you mentioned in the earlier discussion, as one of the remaining elements of the MOU yet to be resolved. And so that's a key one. And I'm sure the parties who are behind the Pathways Initiative, the Oil Sands Alliance, likely have a host of issues they want to resolve with the federal government and the government of Alberta. And they just this week have said they have those recommendations before the levels of government and are seeking action. So it's not, it seems, from their lack of trying to move these projects forward, and we'll have to wait and see how the governments respond to what Oil Sands Alliance has put forward.
There's considerable emphasis in the MOU on working with the Indigenous peoples. What's the perspective from CCA and its members on this element?
Well, we're much like our friends in the upstream part of the industry, quite proud of the new relationships that have been struck with Indigenous communities, not only the direct employment, the contracting of Indigenous businesses across pipeline rights of way, the capacity building, environmental monitoring, and now we're seeing equity. So, we look across the country, there are few industries that have partnered as well as the energy industry has in recent years with Indigenous communities to bring forward economic reconciliation in real, meaningful ways. And so this is fundamentally a new requirement, principle of doing business in the energy business in Canada. And when you look to projects like Coastal GasLink, to Trans Mountain, as well as the new joint ventures with Indigenous communities in LNG on the West Coast, profound success stories, profound amounts of financial benefits have occurred to those communities with the partnership with industry. And again, it's something that our industry looks forward to, is proud of, and knows is part of responsible resource development in Canada.
Now, in the case of a project such as Enbridge's recently announced Sunrise expansion project, the company hadn't submitted the project's plans to the federal government's major projects office for fast tracking because that project had already been moving forward for several years. Is that the kind of project where the major projects office could have made a significant difference?
Well, we do know, as you rightly pointed out, it has just been set up. I think literally it was announced in legislation last year and staffed not even a year. It was staffed in September with its new CEO, Don Farrell. It is receiving a considerable interest from projects across the country. They have a dozen, maybe 24 projects on their queue. We do see the major project office as being an important conduit, especially for greenfield projects where you have considerable new right-of-way to establish, and looking forward until the federal government actually comes full circle to your first discussion around legislative reform. Until we do see the alignment, coherence of federal regulation, we'd imagine many companies would first try to secure the major project office's support to ensure the project secures the national public interest designation as a first avenue for approval, knowing that the remaining regulatory regime, unless it is changed, can be incredibly onerous, introduce cost and risk and pancaking and delay. So the major project office creates, I'd imagine, a very attractive avenue for project development in Canada until we see more legislative coherence.
And we also have the very recent announcement from the Trump administration authorizing the construction of a new pipeline in the U.S. that could resurrect the route of the abandoned Keystone XL line. What's the reaction from the CC membership to that action?
Well, as mentioned, we are blessed with 171 billion barrels of oil in reserves and a planet that is coming to Canada asking for our energy. And so we are keenly interested to seize the opportunity, as are governments across the country, as is the federal government, to provide responsibly produced energy to the world. And whether the project's future pipelines head west to give us access to new Asian markets, which obviously is a key interest of provinces and the federal government, or south, given the new reality of the U.S. Shale reserves and their decline curves. Canadian energy, with our unique resource, capital has been invested, capital costs have been recovered. We have a fairly visible trajectory to expanding output from our oil sands and SAGD operations, which makes it a very attractive resource for U.S. customers as well as for customers offshore. We're in a great spot, Ernest, to seize the day.
Finally, Evan, at this point, today, specifically the first week of May 2026, how do you see negotiations progressing, especially since there is another deadline coming up for July the 1st?
In which negotiations and what?
The MOU
Oh,
continuing MOU negotiations.
well, we've seen progress to date on again the March 6th, the federal government of Alberta agreed to an approach on environmental assessment, the impact assessment kind of alignment. The carbon pricing is a very complicated element of the MOU. It's not surprising to many of us that it's taken longer. There, in large part, because there is actually an existing carbon market in Alberta. We've had carbon pricing in Alberta as one of the first jurisdictions to implement it. That means that there are deals done between buyers and sellers in the current market. And as you pivot towards a different regime, you have to ensure, as much as you can, that investors who've made decisions in good faith in the existing regime are brought along in the transition to a new regime. This is complex. There are buyers and sellers and positions taken on both sides in the current pricing environment. So I'm not surprised that there's a great degree of complexity as the government of Alberta seeks to achieve its part of this. So, we've heard publicly some comments that it's a matter of weeks. Again, no surprise, this particular element has taken longer than the April 1st deadline.
Yeah, something really important to point out for those of us who are waiting for that. Well, thanks for bringing us up to date, Evan, on this crucial issue. We'll continue to monitor and maybe bring you back in the summer to see how things are progressing at that point.
Happy to do so, Ernest. Great opportunity. Thank you very much for your time today as well.
And I thank you for tuning in. For Business Edge Magazine, I'm Ernest Granson.